Hello. Welcome to the stream. So, I would like to start by... Hello, Josh. I would like to start by saying I apologize for not being able to make it last week. But here we are this time. It's just been a little bit, my life has been a little bit inflexible, if you want to call it that, when it comes to doing my Thursday night readings. But hopefully it will continue without having to be uninterrupted again. But we also have before I get ahead of myself, I will have to take almost a week off of the streams. Not next week, but the week after. I will be train bound, so I will not be able to make it. But yeah, so it's been a minute since we've done something like this, and I would like to introduce to you the Dunwich Horror by H.P. Lovecraft. And it's an odd one, but I think you'll like it. It's one of my favorites by him. Tonight, we have something very, very simple. Sorry, give me just a moment. Something very simple. That would be a whiskey lemonade. Very simple. And it's just, take a whiskey, you take a lemonade, and I threw a stem of rosemary in there, and that's it, unless you want to get a little bit more creative with it, which is perfectly fine. I went ahead and put the recipe in the description if you would like to make yours at home. There's a few variations. One's a spicier one where you throw in a pinch of cayenne. One's a more crisp one, which is you throw a couple mint leaves in there. Then another is a little bit of sweet and sour if you want to make it a bit more sour than it already is. Anywho, shall we begin? Let me try to find the adequate lighting here. I believe this will do. Hopefully, you can hear me well enough. It would seem as if I'm audible from where I am, but I don't know where you guys are, so hopefully you guys can hear me. Without further ado, the Dunwich Horror. Gorgons and hydras and chimeras, dire stories of Solano and the harpies may reproduce themselves in the brain of superstition, but they were there before. There are transcripts, types, the archetypes are in us, and the eternal. How else should the recital of that which we know in a waking sense to be false come to affect us at all? Is it that we naturally conceive terror from such objects, considered in their capacity of being able to inflict upon us bodily injury? Oh, least of all, these terrors are of older standing. They date beyond the body, or without the body. They would have been the same. That is the kind of fear here treated as purely spiritual. That is strong in proportion as it is objectless on earth. That it predominates in the period of our sinless infancy. Our difficulties in the solution of which might afford some probable insight into the antemundane condition, and a peep, at least, into the shadowland of pre-existence. Chapter 1. When a traveler in the north-central Massachusetts takes the wrong fork at the junction of Aylesbury Pike, just beyond Dean's Corners, he comes upon a lonely and curious country. The ground gets higher against the ruts of the dusty, curving road. The trees of the frequent forest belts seem too large, and the wild weeds, brambles, and grasses attain a luxuriance not often found in settled regions. At the same time, the planted fields appear singularly few and barren, while the sparsely scattered houses wear a surprisingly uniform aspect of age, squalor, and dilapidation. Without knowing why, one hesitates to ask directions from the gnarled, solitary figures spiced now and then on crumbling doorsteps or on the sloping, rock-strewn meadows. Those figures are so silent and furtive that one feels somehow confronted by forbidden things. With the road, I need to adjust the light. I just cannot find the appropriate lighting for me to be able to read this. Okay, I think that might do it. Sorry. Okay. When a rise in the road brings the mountains in view above the deep woods, the feeling of strange uneasiness is increased. The summits are too rounded and symmetrical to give a rise to a sense of comfort and naturalness, and sometimes the sky silhouettes with a special clearness the queer circles of tall stone pillars with which most of them are crowned. Gorges and ravines in problematical depth intersect the way, and the crude wooden bridges always seem of dubious safety. When the road dips again... Sorry. Phone fell. Thanks, Josh, for your concern. Sorry, there is just so much. I cannot see anything in here. It's so hard to get a good ambiance and also at the same time be able to see. So I need to figure that out still. I'm not really able to, I'm not at a point where I can really figure that out, but we'll get there. Let me adjust the microphone. When the road dips again, there are stretches of marshland that one instinctively dislikes, and indeed almost fears at evening, when unseen whippoorwills chatter and the fireflies come out in abnormal profusion to dance to the raucous, creepily insistent rhythms of stridently piping bullfrogs. The thin, shining line of Miskatonic's upper reaches has an oddly serpent-like suggestion as it winds close to the feet of the domed hills along which it rises. As the hills draw nearer, one heeds their wooden sides more than their stone-crowned tops. Those sides loom up darkly and precipitously that one wishes that they would keep their distance, but there is no road by which to escape them. Across a covered bridge, one sees a small village huddled between the stream and the vertical slope of Round Mountain, and wonders at the cluster of the rotting gambrel roofs bespeaking an earlier architectural period than that of the neighboring region. It is not reassuring to see, on a closer glance, that most of the houses are deserted and falling to ruin, and that the broken steepled church now harbors the one slovenly mercantile establishment of that hamlet. One dreads to trust the tenebrous tunnel of the bridge, yet there is no way to avoid it. Once across, it is hard to prevent the impression of a faint, malign odor about the village street, as the massed mold of decay of centuries. It is always a relief to get clear of the place and to follow the narrow road around the base of the hills and across the level country beyond it till it rejoins the Aylesbury Pike. Afterward, one sometimes learns that one has been through Dunwich. Outsiders visit Dunwich as seldom as possible, and since a certain season of horror, all the signboards pointing toward it have been taken down. The scenery, judged by any ordinary aesthetic canon, is more than commonly beautiful. Yet there is no influx of artists or summer tourists. 2 centuries ago, when talk of witch blood, Satan worship, and strange forest presences was not laughed at, it was custom to give reasons for avoiding the locality. In our sensible age, since the Dunwich horror of 1928 was hushed up by those who had the town's and the world's welfare at heart, people shun it without knowing exactly why. Perhaps one reason, though it cannot apply to uninformed strangers, is that the natives are now repellently decadent, having gone far along that path of retrogression so common in many New England backwaters. They have come to form a race by themselves, with the well-defined mental and physical stigmata of degeneracy and inbreeding. The average of their intelligence is woefully low, whilst their annals reek of overt viciousness, of half-hidden murders, incests, and deeds almost unnameable, violence and perversity. The old gentry, representing the 2 or 3 armigerous families which came from Salem in 1692, have kept somewhat above the general level of decay, though many branches are sunk into the sordid populace so deeply that only their names remain as a key to the origin they disgrace. Some of the Whateleys and bishops still send their eldest sons to Harvard and Miskatonic, though those sons seldom return to the moldering gambrel roofs under which they and their ancestors were born. No one, even those who have the facts concerning the recent horror, can say just what the matter is with Dunwich. Though old legends speak of unhallowed rites in conclaves of the Indians, amidst which they called forbidden shapes of shadow out of the great rounded hills, and made wild orgiastic prayers that were answered by loud crackings and rumblings from the ground below. In 1747, the Reverend Abia, sorry, I have not seen this name before, Abia Hoadley, newly come from the Congregational Church at Dunwich Village, preached a memorable sermon on the close presence of Satan and his imps, in which he said, "It must be allowed that these blasphemies of an infernal train of demons are matters of too common knowledge to be denied. The cursed voices of Azazel and Boozeriel and Beelzebub and Belial, being heard now from under the ground by above score of credible witnesses now living. I myself did not more than a fortnight ago catch a very plain discourse of evil powers in the hill behind my house, wherein there were a rattling and a rolling, groaning, screeching, and hissing, such as no things of this earth could raise up, and which must needs have come from the caves that only black magic can discover, and only the devil can unlock. Mr. Hoadley disappeared soon after delivering this sermon, but the text, printed in Springfield, is still extant. Noises in the hills continued to be reported from year to year, and still form a puzzle to geologists and physiographers. Other traditions tell of foul odors near the hill-crowning circles of stone pillars, and of rushing, airy presences to be heard faintly at certain hours from stated points at the bottom of the great ravines, while still others try to explain the Devil's Hop Yard, a bleak, blasted hillside where no tree, shrub, or grass blade will grow. Then, too, the natives are mortally afraid of the numerous whippoorwills which grow vocal on warm nights. It is vowed that the birds are psychopomps lying in wait for the souls of the dying, and that they time their eerie cries in unison with the sufferer's struggling breath. If they can catch the fleeing soul when it leaves the body, they instantly flutter away chittering in demonic laughter, but if they fail, they subside gradually into disappointed silence. These tales, of course, are obsolete and ridiculous, because they have come down from very old times. Dunwich is indeed ridiculously old, older by far than any of the communities within 30 miles of it. South of the village, one might still spy the cellar walls and chimney of the ancient Bishop House, which was built before 1700, whilst the ruins of the mill at the falls, built in 1806, form the most modern piece of architecture to be seen. Industry did not flourish here. In the 19th century, factory movement proved short-lived. Oldest of all are the great rings of hewn stone on the hilltops, but these are more generally attributed to the Native Americans than to the settlers. Deposits of skulls and bones found within these circles and around sizable table-like rock on Sentinel Hill sustain the popular belief that such spots were once the burial places of the Pocumtucks, even though many ethnologists, disregarding the absurd improbability of such a theory, persist in believing the remains Caucasian. Chapter 2. It was the township of Dunwich in which a large and partly inhabited farmhouse set against the hillside 4 miles from the village and 1.5 miles from any other dwelling. That Wilbur Whately was born at 5 a.m. on a Sunday, February 2nd, 1913. This date was recalled because of the Candlemas, which people in Dunwich curiously observe under another name, and because the noises in the hills had sounded, and all the dogs of the countryside had barked persistently throughout the night before. Less worthy of notice was the fact that the mother was one of the decadent Whateleys, a somewhat deformed, unattractive albino woman of 35, living with an aged, half-insane father about whom the most frightful tales of wizardry had been whispered in his youth. Lavinia Whately had no known husband, but according to the custom of the region, made no attempt to disavow the child. Concerning the other side of whose ancestry the country folk might, and did, speculate as widely as they chose. On the contrary, she seemed strangely proud of the dark, goatish-looking infant who formed such a contrast to her own sickly and pink-eyed albinism, and was heard to mutter many curious prophecies about its unusual powers and tremendous future. Lavinia was one who would be apt to mutter such things, for she was a lone creature given to wandering amidst thunderstorms in the hills and trying to read the great odorous books which her father had inherited through 2 centuries of Whateleys, and which were fast falling to pieces with age. In wormholes. She had never been to school, but it was filled with disjointed scraps of ancient lore that old Whately had taught her. The remote farmhouse had always been feared because of the old Whately's reputation for black magic and the unexplained death by violence of Mrs. Whately when Lavinia was 12 years old, and had not helped to make the place popular. Isolated among strange influences, Lavinia was fond of wild and grandiose daydreams and singular occupations, nor was her leisure much taken up by household cares in a home from which all standards of order and cleanliness had long disappeared. There was a hideous screaming which echoed above even the hill noises and dogs barking on the night Wilbur was born, but no known doctor or midwife presided in his coming. Neighbors knew nothing of him till a week afterward, when old Whately drove his sleigh through the snow into Dunwich village, and discoursed incoherently to the group of loungers at Osborne's general store. There seemed to be a change in the old man, an added element of furtiveness, in the clouded brain, which subtly transformed him from an object to a subject of fear. Though he was not one to be perturbed by any common family event, amidst it all, he showed some trace of pride later noticed in his daughter, and what he said of the child's paternity was remembered by many of his hearers years afterward. I don't care what folks think. If Lavinia's boy looked like his pa, he wouldn't look nothing like he expect. You needn't think the only folks is the folks hereabouts. Lavinia's read some and has seed some things the most of ye only tell about. I calculate her man is a good husband, and as ye can find this side of Aylesbury, and if ye knowed as much about the hills as I do ye wouldn't ask no better church wedding nor hern. Let me tell ye something. Some day you folks'll hear and bear a child. Lavinia's a callin' its father's name on the top of Sentinel Hill. The only persons who saw Wilbur during the first month of his life were old Zachariah Whately, of the undecayed Whateleys, and Earl Sawyer, common-law wife, Mamie Bishop. Mamie's visit was frankly one of curiosity, and her subsequent tales did justice to her observations, but Zachariah came to lead a pair of Alderney cows which old Whately had bought of his son Curtis. This marked the beginning of a course of cattle buying on the part of small Wilbur's family, which ended only in 1928, when the Dunwich horror came and went. Yet at no time did the ramshackle Whately barn seem overcrowded with livestock. There came a period when people were curious enough to steal up and count the herd that grazed precariously on the steep hillside above the old farmhouse, and they could never find more than 10 or 12 anemic, bloodless-looking specimens. Evidently, some blight or distemper, perhaps sprung from the old unwholesome pasturage, or the diseased fungi and timbers of the filthy barn, caused a heavy mortality amongst the Whately animals. Odd wounds and sores, having something of the aspect of incisions, seemed to afflict the visible cattle. And once or twice during the earlier months, certain callers fancied that they could discern similar sores about the throats of the gray, unshaven old man-haired albino daughter. In the spring after Wilbur's birth, Lavinia resumed her customary rambles in the hills, bearing her misproportioned arms the swarthy child. Public interest in the Whateleys subsided after most of the country folk had seen the baby, and no one bothered to comment on the swift development which that newcomer seemed every day to exhibit. Wilbur's growth was indeed phenomenal, for within 3 months of his birth he had attained the size and muscular power not often found in infants under a full year of age. His motions and even his vocal sounds showed a restraint and deliberateness highly peculiar of an infant, and no one was really unprepared when, at 7 months, he began to walk unassisted, with falterings which another month was sufficient to remove. It was somewhat after this time, on Halloween, that a great blaze was seen at midnight atop the top of Sentinel Hill, where the old table-like stone stands amidst the tumulus of ancient bones. Considerable talk was started when Silas Bishop of the undecayed bishops mentioned having seen the boy running sturdily up the hill ahead of his mother about an hour before the blaze was remarked. Silas was rounding up a stray heifer, but he nearly forgot his mission when he fleetingly spied the two figures in the dim light of his lantern. They darted almost noiselessly through the underbrush, and the astonished watcher seemed to think they were entirely unclothed. Afterward, he could not be sure about the boy, who may have had some kind of fringe belt and a pair of dark trunks or trousers on. Wilbur was never subsequently seen alive and conscious without complete and tightly buttoned attire, the disarrangement or threatened disarrangement of which always seemed to fill him with anger and alarm. His contrast with his squalid mother and grandfather in this respect was thought very notable until the horror of 1928 suggested the most valid of reasons. The next January gossips were mildly interested in the fact that Lavinia's brat had commenced to talk at the age of only 11 months. His speech was somewhat remarkable, both because of its difference from the ordinary accents of the region, and because it displayed a freedom from infantile lispings of which many children of 3 or 4 might well be proud. The boy was not talkative, yet when he spoke, he seemed to reflect some elusive element wholly unpossessed by Dunwich and its denizens. The strangeness did not reside in what he said, or even in the simple idioms that he used, but seemed vaguely linked with his intonation or with the internal organs that produced the spoken sounds. His facial aspect, too, was remarkable for its maturity, for though he shared his mother's and grandfather's chinlessness, his firm and precociously shaped nose united with the expression of his large, dark, almost Latin eyes to give him an air of quasi-adulthood and well-nigh intelligence. He was, however, exceedingly ugly despite his appearance of brilliancy, there being something almost goatish or animalistic about his lips, large pored and yellowish skin, coarse crinkly hair, and oddly elongated ears. He was soon disliked even more decidedly than his mother and grandsire, and all conjectures about him were spiced with references to the bygone magic of Old Whately, and how the hills once shook when he shrieked the dreadful name of Yog-Sothoth in the midst of the circle of stones with a great book open in his arms before him. Dogs abhorred the boy, and he was always obliged to take various defensive measures against their barking menace. Chapter 3. Meanwhile, Old Whately continued to buy cattle without measurably increasing the size of his herd. He also cut timber and began to repair the unused parts of his house. A spacious, peaked roof, affair whose rear end was buried entirely in the rocky hillside, and whose 3 least-ruined ground floor rooms had always been sufficient for himself and his daughter. There must have been prodigious reserves of strength in the old man to enable him to accomplish so much hard labor, and though he still babbled dementedly at times, his carpentry seemed to show the effects of sound calculation, It had already begun as soon as Wilbur was born, when one of the many tool sheds had been put suddenly in order, clapboarded and fitted with a stout fresh lock. Now, in restoring the abandoned upper story of the house, he was a no less thorough craftsman. His mania showed itself only his tight boarding up of the windows in the reclaimed section, though many declared that it was a crazy thing to bother with the reclamation at all. Sorry. Less inexplicable was his fitting up of another downstairs room for his new grandson, a room which several callers saw. Sorry, choking on spit. Though no one was ever admitted to the closely boarded upper story. This chamber he lined with tall, firm shelving, along which he began gradually to arrange, in apparently careful order, all the rotting ancient books and parts of books which seemed his own day had been heaped promiscuously in odd corners of the various rooms. I made some use of him, he would say, as he tried to mend a torn black letter page with paste prepared on the rusty kitchen stove, but the boys fittin' to make better use of him. He'd order have him, as well as sought as he can, for they're going to be all his larnin'. When Wilbur was a year and 7 months old, in September 1914, his size and accomplishments were almost alarming. Sorry. He had grown as large as a child of 4 and was fluent and incredibly intelligent talker. He ran freely about the fields and hills and accompanied his mother on all her wanderings. At home, he would pore diligently over the queer pictures and charts in his grandfather's books, while old Whately would instruct and I don't know that word, sorry. Chise him through the long, hushed afternoons. By this time, the restoration of the house was finished, and those who watched it wondered why one of the upper windows had been made into a solid plank door. It was a window in the rear of the east gable end, close against the hill, and no one could imagine why a cleated wooden runway was built up from the ground. About the period of this work's completion, people noticed that the old tool house, tightly locked and windowlessly clapboarded since Wilbur's birth, had been abandoned again. The door swung listlessly open, and when Earl Sawyer once stepped within after a cattle-selling call on old Whately, he was quite discomposed by the singular odor he had encountered. Such a stench, he averred, as he had never before smelled in all his life, except near the Native American circles on the hills, which could not come from anything sane of this earth. But then, the homes and sheds of Dunwich folk have never been remarkable for olfactory immaculateness. Yes, sorry. The following months were void of visible events, save that everyone swore to a slow but a steady increase of the mysterious hill noises. On May Eve of 1915, there were tremors which even the Aylesbury people felt, whilst the following Halloween produced an underground rumbling queerly synchronized with the bursts of flame, them which Whately's doings, from the summit of Sentinel Hill. Wilbur was growing up uncannily, so that he looked like a boy of 10 as he entered his 4th year. He read avidly by himself now, but talked much less than formerly. He settled taciturnly. One more try. A settled taciturnity was absorbing him, and for the first time, people began to speak specifically of the dawning look of evil in his goatish face. He would sometimes mutter in unfamiliar jargon and chant of bizarre rhythms, which chilled the listener with a sense of unexplainable terror. The aversion displayed toward him by dogs had now become a matter of wide remark, and he was obliged to carry a pistol in order to traverse the countryside in safety. His occasional use of the weapon did not enhance his popularity amongst the owners of the canine guardians. The few callers at the house would often find Lavinia alone on the ground floor, while odd cries and footsteps resounded in the boarded-up 2nd story. She would never tell what her father and boy were doing up there, though once she turned pale and displayed an abnormal degree of fear when a jocose fish peddler tried the locked door leading to the stairway. That peddler told the store loungers at Dunwich village that he thought he heard a horse stamping on that floor above. The loungers reflected, thinking of the door in the runway, and of the cattle that so swiftly disappeared. Then they shuddered as they recalled the tales of old Whately's youth, and the strange things that are called out of the earth when a bullock is sacrificed at the proper time to certain heathen gods. It had, for some time, been noticed that dogs had begun to hate and fear the whole Whately place as violently as they hated and feared Wilbur personally. In 1917, the war came. Squire Sawyer Whately, as chairman of the local draft board, had hard work finding a quota of young Dunwich men fit to even be sent to a development camp. The government, alarmed at such signs of wholesale regional decadence, sent several officers and medical experts to investigate, conducting a survey which New England newspaper readers may still recall. It was the publicity attending the investigation which set reporters on the track of the Whateleys and caused the Boston Globe and Arkham Advertiser to print flamboyant Sunday stories of young Wilbur's precociousness, old Whately's black magic, in the shelves of strange books, the sealed 2nd story of the ancient farmhouse, and the weirdness of the whole region and its hill noises. Wilbur was 4.5 then, and looked like a lad of 15. His lips and cheeks were fuzzy, with coarse, dark down, and his voice had begun to break. Earl Sawyer went to the Whately place with both sets of reporters and cameramen, and called their attention to the queer stench which now seemed to trickle down from the sealed upper spaces. It was, as he said, exactly like the smell he had found in the tool shed abandoned when the house was finally repaired. and like the faint odors which he sometimes thought he caught near the stone circles of the mountains, Dunwich folk read the stories when they appeared, and grinned over the obvious mistakes. They wondered, too, why the writers made so much of the fact that old Whately always paid for his cattle in gold pieces of extremely ancient date. The Whateleys had received their visitors with ill-concealed distaste, though they did not dare court further publicity by a violent resistance or refusal to talk. Chapter 4. For a decade, the annals of the Whateleys sink indistinguishably into the life of a morbid community used to their old queer ways, and hardened to their May Eve and All Hallows orgies. Twice a year, they would light fires on top of the Sentinel Hill, of which times the mountain rumblings would recur with greater and greater violence, while at all seasons there were strange and portentous doings at the lonely farmhouse. In the course of time, callers professed to hear sounds in the sealed upper story, even when the family were downstairs, and they wondered how swiftly or how lingeringly a cow or bullock was usually sacrificed. There was talk of a complaint to the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, but nothing ever came of it, since Dunwich folk are never anxious to call the outside world's attention to themselves. About 1923, when Wilbur was a boy of 10, whose mind, voice, stature, and bearded face gave all the impressions of maturity, a second great siege of carpentry went on at the old house. It was all inside the sealed upper part, and from bits of discarded lumber, people concluded that the youth and his grandfather had knocked out all the partitions and even removed the attic floor, leaving only one vast open void between the ground story and the peaked roof. They had torn down the great central chimney, too, and fitted the rusty range with a flimsy outside tin stovepipe. In the spring after this event, old Whately noticed that the growing number of whippoorwills that would come out of the cold spring glen to chirp under his window at night. He seemed to regard the circumstance as one of great significance, and told the loungers at Osborne's that he thought his time had almost come. They whistle and jest and tune with my breathing now, he said, and I guess they're getting ready to catch my soul. They know it's a going out, and don't calculate to miss it. You'll know, boys, arter I'm gone, whether they get me or not. If they do, they'll keep up singing and laughing till break of day. If they don't, they'll kinder quiet down like. I expect 'em that the souls they hunts for have some pretty tough tussles sometimes. On Lammas night, 1924, Dr. Houghton of Aylesbury was hastily summoned by Wilbur Whately, who had lashed his one remaining horse through the darkness and telephoned from Osborne's in the village. He found old Whately in a very grave state, with cardiac action and stertorous breathing that told of an end not far off. The shapeless albino daughter an oddly bearded grandson, stood by the bedside, whilst the vacant abyss overhead there came a disquieting suggestion of rhythmical surging or lapping, as the waves of some level beach. The doctor, though, was chiefly disturbed by the chattering night birds outside, in seemingly limitless legion of whippoorwills that cried their endless message in repetitions, timed diabolically to the wheezing gasps of the dying man. It was uncanny and unnatural, too much, thought Dr. Houghton, like the whole of the region he had entered so reluctantly in response to the urgent call. Toward 1 o'clock, old Whately gained consciousness and interrupted his wheezing to choke out a few words to his grandson. "More space, Willie. More space soon. You grows, and that grows faster. It'll be ready to starve you soon, boy. Open up the gates to Yog-Sothoth, which, with the long chant that you'll find on page 751 of the complete edition, and then put a match to the prison. Fire from earth can't burn it now." He was obviously quite mad. After a pause, during which the flock of whippoorwills outside adjusted their cries to the altered tempo, while some indications of the strange hill noises came from far off, he added another sentence or two. "Feed it regular, Willie, and mind the quantity, but don't let it grow too fast for the place, for if bus quarters or gets out afore ye opens the Yog-Sothoth, it's all over and no use. Only them from beyond kin can make, multiply, and work. Only them, the old uns, as wants to come back." But speech gave place to gasps again, and Lavinia screamed at the way the whippoorwills followed the change. It was the same for more than an hour, when finally the throaty rattle came. Dr. Houghton drew shrunken lids over the glazing gray eyes as the tumult of the birds faded imperceptibly to silence. Lavinia sobbed, but Wilbur only chuckled whilst the hill noises rumbled faintly. "They didn't get him," he muttered in his heavy bass voice. Wilbur was by this time a scholar of really tremendous erudition in his one-sided way, and was quietly known by correspondence to many librarians in distant places where rare and forbidden books of old days are kept. He was more and more hated and dreaded around the Dunwich because of certain youthful disappearances which suspicion laid vaguely at his door, but was always able to silence inquiry through the fear which the fund of old-time gold, which still, as in grandfather's time, went forth regularly, increasingly, for cattle buying. He was now tremendously mature of aspect, and his height, having reached the normal adult limit, seemed inclined to wax beyond that figure. In 1925, when a scholarly correspondent from Miskatonic University called upon him one day and departed pale and puzzled, he was fully 6 3/4 feet tall. Through all the years, Wilbur had treated his half-deformed albino mother with a growing contempt, finally forbidding her to go to the hills with him on May Eve and Hallowmass. And in 1926, the poor creature complained to Mamie Bishop of being afraid of him. "They's more about him as I knows than I can tell ye, Mamie. she said, and nowadays they's more nor what I know myself. I vow afore God, I don't know what he wants, nor what he's a-trying to do. That Halloween, the hill noises sounded louder than ever, and the fire burned on Sentinel Hill as usual. But people paid more attention to the rhythmical screaming of vast flocks of unnaturally belated whippoorwills, which seemed to be assembled near the unlighted Whately farmhouse. After midnight, their shrill notes burst into a kind of pandemoniac cachinnation which filled all the countryside. And not until dawn did they finally quiet down. And when they vanished, hurrying southward, where they were fully a month overdue. What this meant, no one could quite be certain till later. None of the country folk seemed to have died, but poor Lavinia Whately, the twisted albino, was never seen again. In the summer of 1927, Wilbur repaired 2 sheds in the farmyard and began moving his books and effects out to them. Soon afterward, Earl Sawyer told the loungers at Osborne's that more carpentry was going on in the Whately farmhouse. Wilbur was closing all the doors and windows on the ground floor, and seemed to be taking out the partitions he and his grandfather had done upstairs 4 years before. He was living in one of the sheds, and Sawyer thought he seemed unusually worried and tremulous. People generally suspected him of knowing something about his mother's disappearance, and very few ever approached his neighborhood now. His height had increased to more than 7 feet, and showed no signs of ceasing its development. Chapter 5. The following winter brought an event no less strange than Wilbur's first trip outside the Dunwich region. Correspondence with the Widener Library at Harvard and the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, the British Museum, the University of Buenos Aires, and the Library of Miskatonic University of Arkham had failed to get him the loan of a book he desperately wanted. So at length he set out in person, shabby, dirty, bearded, and uncouth of dialect, to consult a copy at Miskatonic, which was nearest to him geographically, almost 8 feet tall, and carrying a cheap new valise from Osborne's general store. This dark and goatish gargoyle appeared one day in Arkham in quest of the dreaded volume kept under the lock and key at the college library. The hideous Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul Azared and Olaus Wormius's Latin version, as printed in Spain in the 17th century. He had never seen a city before, but had no thought to find his way to the university grounds, where, indeed, he passed heedlessly by the great white-fanged watchdog that barked with unnatural fury and enmity, and tugged frantically at its stout chain. Wilbur had with him the priceless but imperfect copy of Dr. D's English version, which his grandfather had bequeathed him, and upon receiving access to the Latin copy, he at once began to collate the two texts with the aim of discovering a certain passage which would have come on the 751st page of his own defective volume. This much he could not civilly refrain from telling the librarian, the same erudite Henry Armitage, who had once called at the farm, and who now politely plied him with questions. He was looking, he had to admit, for a kind of formula or incantation containing the frightful name Yog-Sothoth, and it puzzled him to find discrepancies, duplications, and ambiguities which made the matter of determination far from easy. As he copied the formula, he finally chose Dr. Armitage, looked involuntarily over his shoulder at the open pages, the left-handed one of which, in the Latin version, contained such monstrous threats to the peace and sanity of the world. Dr. Armitage, associating what he was reading with what he had heard of Dunwich and its brooding presences, and of Wilbur Whately and his dim, hideous aura that stretched from a dubious birth to a cloud of probable matricide, felt a wave of fright as tangible as a draught from a tomb's cold clamminess. The bent, goatish giant before him seemed like the spawn of another planet or dimension, like something only partly of mankind, and linked to the black gulfs of essence and entity that stretch like titan phantasms beyond all spheres of force and matter, space and time. Presently, Wilbur raised his head and began speaking in that strange, resonant fashion which hinted at sound-producing organs unlike the run of mankind's. "Mr. Armitage," he said, "I calculate I've got to take that book home. These things in it I've got to try under certain conditions that I can't get here, and it would be mortal sin to let a red tape rule hold me up. Let me take that thing along, sir, and I swear they won't nobody know the difference. I don't need ye, and I'll take good care of it. It wa'n't me that put this D copy in the shape it is." He stopped before he saw firm denial on the librarian's face, and his own goatish features grew crafty. Armitage, half ready to tell him he might make a copy of what he needs, parts he needed, thought suddenly of the possible consequences and checked himself. There was too much responsibility in giving such a being the key to such blasphemous outer spheres. Whately saw how things stood and tried to answer lightly. "Well, all right. If you feel that way about it, maybe Harvard won't be so fussy as you be." And without saying more, he rose and strode out of the building, stooping at each doorway. Armitage heard the savage yelping of the great watchdog, and studied Whately's gorilla-like lope as he crossed the bit of campus visible from the window. He thought of the wild tales he had heard, and recalled the old Sunday stories in the Advertiser. These things and the lore that he had picked up from the Dunwich rustics and villagers during one visit there, unseen things not of earth, or at least not of tri-dimensional earth, rushed fetid and horrible through the New England's glens. and brooded obscenely on the mountain tops. Of this he had long felt certain. Now he seemed to sense the close presence of a hellish advance in the black dominion of the ancient and once passive nightmare. He locked away the Necronomicon with a shudder of disgust. But the room still reeked with an unholy and unidentifiable stench. "As a foulness shall ye know them," he quoted. Yes, the odor was the same as that which had sickened him at the Whately farmhouse less than 3 years before. He thought of Wilbur, goatish and ominous, once again, and laughed mockingly at the village rumors of his parentage. "Inbreeding," Armitage muttered, half aloud to himself. "Great God, what simpletons! Show them Arthur Machen's great god Pan, and they'll think of it a common Dunwich scandal. But what thing, what cursed shapeless influence, on or off the three-dimensional earth, was Wilbur Whately's father, born on Candlemas, 9 months after the May Eve of 1912, when the talk about the queer earth noises reached clear to Arkham? What walked on the mountains that May night? What rude horror fastened itself on the world in half-human flesh and blood? During the ensuing weeks, Dr. Armitage set out to collect all possible data on Wilbur Whately and the formless presences around Dunwich. He got in communication with Dr. Houghton of Aylesbury, who had attended old Whately in his last illness, and found much to ponder over in the grandfather's last words, as quoted by the physician. A visit to Dunwich village failed to bring out much that was new, but a close survey of the Necronomicon in those parts which Wilbur had sought so avidly seemed to supply new and terrible clues to the nature, methods, and desires of the strange evil so vaguely threatening this planet. Talks with several students of archaic lore in Boston, amazement which passed slowly through the very degrees of alarm to a state of really acute spiritual fear. As the summer drew on, he felt dimly that something ought to be done about the lurking terrors on the upper Miskatonic Valley, and about the monstrous being known as the human world as Wilbur Whately. Chapter 6. The Dunwich horror itself came between Lammas and the equinox in 1928, and Dr. Armitage was among those who witnessed its monstrous prologue. He had heard, meanwhile, of Whately's grotesque trip to the Cambridge, and of his frantic efforts to borrow or copy from the Necronomicon at the Widener Library. Those efforts had been in vain, since Armitage had issued warnings of the keenest intensity to all librarians having charge of the dreaded volume. Wilbur had been shockingly nervous at Cambridge, anxious for the book, yet almost equally anxious to get home again, as he feared the results of being away too long. Early in August, the half-expected outcome had developed, and in the small hours of the 3rd, Dr. Armitage was awakened suddenly by the wild, fierce cries of the savage watchdog on the college campus. Deep and terrible, the snarling half-mad growls and barks continued, always in mounting volume, but with hideously significant pauses. Then there rang out a scream from a wholly different throat, such a scream as roused half the sleepers of Arkham and haunted their dreams ever afterward, such a scream as could come from no being born of earth or wholly of earth. Armitage, hastening into some clothing and rushing across the street and lawn to the college buildings, saw that the others were ahead of him, and heard the echoes of a burglar alarm still shrilling from the library. An open window showed black and gaping in the moonlight. What had come had indeed completed its entrance, for the barking and screaming, now fast fading into a mixed low growling and moaning, proceeded unmistakably from within. Some instinct warned Armitage that what was taking place was not a thing for unfortified eyes to see, and so he brushed back the crowd with authority as he unlocked the vestibule door. Among the others, he saw Professor Warren Rice and Dr. Francis Morgan, men to whom he had some of his conjectures and misgivings. In these two, he motioned to accompany him inside. The inward sounds, except for a watchful, droning whine from the dog, had by this time quite subsided. But Armitage now perceived with a sudden start that a loud chorus of whippoorwills among the shrubbery had commenced a damnably rhythmical piping, as if in unison with the last breaths of a dying man. The building was full of a frightful stench which Dr. Armitage knew too well, and the three men rushed across the hall to the small genealogical reading room, whence the low whining came. For a second, nobody dared to turn on the light. Then Armitage summoned up his courage and snapped the switch. One of the three, it is not certain which, shrieked aloud at what sprawled before them among disordered tables and overturned chairs. Rice declares that he wholly lost consciousness for an instant, though he did not stumble or fall. The thing that lay half bent on its side in a fetid pool of greenish-yellow ichor and tarry stickiness was almost 9 feet tall, and the dog had torn off all the clothing and some of the skin. It was not quite dead, but twitched silently and spasmodically, while its chest heaved in monstrous unison with the mad piping of the expectant whippoorwills outside. Bits of the bits of the shoe leather and fragments of apparel were scattered around the room, and just inside the window an empty canvas sack lay where it had evidently been thrown. Near the central desk, a revolver had fallen, and dented but undischarged cartridge, later explaining why it had not been fired. The thing itself, however, crowded out all other images of the time. It would be trite and not wholly accurate to say that no human pen could describe it, but one may properly say that it could not be vividly visualized by anyone whose ideas of aspect and contour are too closely bound up with the common life forms of this planet, and of the 3 known dimensions. It was partly human, beyond a doubt, with very man-like hands and head, and the goatish chinless face had the stamp of the Whateleys upon it, but the torso and lower parts of the body were teratologically fabulous, so that only generous clothing could have ever enabled it to walk on earth unchallenged or uneradicated. Above the waist, it was semi-anthropomorphic, though its chest, where the dog's rending paws still rested watchfully, had the leathery, reticulated hide of a crocodile or alligator. The back was piebald with yellow and black, and dimly suggested the squamous covering of certain snakes. Below the waist, though, it was the worst, for here all human resemblance was left off, and sheer fantasy began. The skin was thickly covered with coarse black fur, and from the abdomen a score of long greenish-gray tentacles with red sucking mouths protruded limply. Their arrangement was odd, and seemed to follow the symmetries of some cosmic geometry unknown to Earth or of the solar system. On each of the hips, deep set in a kind of pinkish, silated orbit, was what seemed to be a rudimentary eye, whilst in lieu of a tail there depended a kind of trunk or feeler with purple annular markings, and with many evidences of being an undeveloped mouth or throat. The limbs, save for the black fur, roughly resembled the hind legs of a prehistoric earth giant saurians, and terminated in ridgy, veined pads that were neither hooves nor claws. When the thing breathed, its tails and tentacles rhythmically changed in color, as if from some circulatory cause normal to the non-human side of ancestry. In the tentacles, this was observable as a deepening of the greenish tinge, whilst in the tail it was a manifest as a yellowish appearance which alternated with a sickly grayish white in the spaces between the purple rings. Of genuine blood there was none, only the fetid greenish-yellow ichor, which trickled along the painted floor beyond the radius of stickiness, and left a curious discoloration behind it. As the presence of the three men seemed to rouse the dying thing, it began to mumble without turning or raising its head. Dr. Armitage made no written record of its mouthings, but asserts confidently that nothing in English was uttered. At first, the syllables defied all correlation with any speech of earth, but toward the last there came some disjointed fragments, evidently taken from the Necronomicon, that monstrous blasphemy in the quest of which the thing had perished. These fragments, as Armitage recalls, ran something like Nai, Neha, Ha, Boog, Shagog, Yabab, Yoxatoth, Yoxatoth. They trailed off into nothingness as the whippoorwills shrieked in rhythmical crescendos of unholy anticipation. Then came a halt in the gasping as the dog raised its head in a long, lugubrious howl. A change came over the yellow, goatish face of the prostrate thing, and the great black eyes fell in appallingly. Outside the window, the shrilling of the whippoorwills had suddenly ceased, and above the murmurs of the gathering crowd there came the sound of a panic-struck whirring and fluttering. Against the moon vast clouds of feathery watchers rose and raced from sight, frantic at that which had sought for prey. All at once the dog started up abruptly, gave a frightened bark, and leapt nervously out the window by which had entered. A cry rose from the crowd, and Armitage shouted to the men outside that no one must be admitted till the police or medical examiner came. He was thankful that the windows were just too high to permit of peering in, and drew the dark curtains carefully down over each one. By this time, 2 policemen had arrived, and Dr. Morian, meeting them in the vestibule, was urging them, for their own sakes, to postpone entrance to the stench-filled reading room till the examiner came and the prostrate thing could be covered up. Meanwhile, frightful changes were taking place on the floor. One need not describe the kind of and rate of shrinkage and disintegration that occurred before the eyes of Dr. Armitage and Professor Rice, but it is permissible to say that aside from the external appearance of face and hands, the really human element of Wilbur Whately must have been very small. When the medical examiner came, there was only a sticky, whitish mass on the painted boards, and the monstrous odor had nearly disappeared. Apparently, Whately had no skull or bony skeleton, at least in any true or stable sense. He had taken somewhat after his unknown father. I'm going to leave it at that. No, the story is not completely finished yet, but we are halfway through it. So I will finish the second half next time. Yeah, it was nice to be back and doing this. We will continue the story on Thursday of next week. Yeah, I hope you guys all enjoyed. And if you did, please like, subscribe, and share, possibly, if you're feeling generous. And I thank you for coming out. Please have a good evening, and